Our last study in the book of Ruth will be very brief, because it comprises chapter 4 verses 17, or the second part of verse 17, through to chapter 22. And it's mainly a list of names. But in this list of names we have a lovely postscript to the book of Ruth. In chapter 1 verse 1 our thoughts were directed back to the book of Judges. In that book there was one phrase that is regularly repeated. In Judges 17:6, 18:1, 19:1, 21:25 we're told, there was no king in those days. And this was not a careless or accidental repetition. In Old Testament times the life of the nation was seen as closely linked to the life of the king. His example set the example by which his people were expected to follow. But in the time of the Judges, there was no such example. Everyone did as he saw fit, as Judges 21 verse 25 says. The people were then in need of a leader after God's own heart. And this is really the verdict of the whole book of Judges. The book of Ruth picks this up. It tells us of a farmer in Bethlehem and a stranger from Moab who lived not for themselves but for God. It shows that their faithfulness was part of God's plan to meet the needs of all his people and to bless them more abundantly than they could ever have imagined. Ruth bore a son who was to be the grandfather of Israel's greatest King David. And David himself was a king, among whose descendants great David's greater son would one day be born. One student of the book of Ruth once said, and in his life, that is Jesus, in terms of physical descent, his life was linked to the story of a Moabite girl gleaning in a barley field, miles from home, to a caring mother-in-law and a loving kinsman, to a nighttime conversation at the threshing floor, to the willingness of a wealthy farmer to go beyond the requirements of the law in his care for the needy. In short, it is in the ordinariness of the lives of ordinary people that God is working his purposes out. Future significant lives were bound up with the history of Ruth. And doubtless those very qualities which David possessed were the fruit of a great grandparental example. How often that is true. And thus Ruth and Boaz's apparently insignificant lives are seen to be of vital importance for us all. What an encouragement to our own faithfulness and obedience, even though we may feel ourselves to be utterly insignificant.